Welcome to Deduction Junction, where mysteries unfold and every detail holds a clue. Step into the brilliant mind of Hercule Poirot, the world's greatest detective, as we journey through his most intriguing cases. With logic sharper than a razor and an eye for the smallest detail, Poirot unravels crimes that leave others baffled. Get ready to immerse yourself in a world of suspense, deception, and of course, the little gray cells. The investigation begins now. Chapter 1. The Riddle of the Broken Chessboard. The rain pattered against the windows of Whitehaven Manor, a grand yet imposing country estate nestled deep within the Sussex countryside. The house, built in the late 18th century, was an architectural contradiction, elegantly designed yet shadowed by a perpetual air of unease. Tonight, its halls were alive with murmurs, the distant chime of fine crystal, and the gentle strains of a piano drifting from the drawing room. A gathering of intellectuals and dignitaries had been assembled by Sir Reginald Willoughby, a retired diplomat known for his sharp wit and an even sharper tongue. He was a man of great influence, well versed in the affairs of Europe, and tonight's gathering had an air of mystery to it. It was not merely a social event, it was a game, or, as Sir Reginald had called it, a contest of minds, played upon the battlefield of logic. The central attraction of the evening was a game of chess, a match between two of the finest strategic minds in attendance. Leonard Styles, a renowned mathematician and former Oxford professor, whose theories on probability had revolutionized statistical analysis. Edgar Norton, a reclusive yet brilliant financier, known for his near-obsessive approach to investments, always calculating, always 5 steps ahead. The two men sat in front of a polished mahogany chessboard, deep in thought. The firelight flickered over their concentrated faces, and the guests had gathered in a semicircle, watching in hushed anticipation. The tension in the air was palpable. Yet just as Styles reached forward to make his move, something shattered the atmosphere. A loud, sudden crash. Every head turned toward the source of the disturbance. It was Sir Reginald Willoughby, standing stiffly near the fireplace, his face ashen, his gaze locked onto the broken chessboard on the floor. The wooden pieces lay scattered across the carpet, some cracked, others missing entirely. The room fell silent. Sir Reginald's fingers twitched as though he wished to speak, but before he could utter a word, his body lurched forward, and he collapsed. A gasp echoed through the room. Lady Margaret Willoughby, his wife, let out a small cry, rushing to his side. But it was too late. Sir Reginald Willoughby was dead, and the broken chessboard lay beside him, a silent witness to a crime that had yet to be understood. The morning that followed was grey and heavy with mist, the kind that clung stubbornly to the earth and swallowed sound before it could travel too far. In a first-class carriage of the London to Brighton train, Hercule Poirot sat, immaculate as ever, a cup of coffee before him, and a neatly pressed newspaper in his hands. Opposite him, Captain Arthur Hastings shifted uneasily, his blue eyes flickering toward Poirot's serene expression. "My dear Poirot," Hastings said at last, "you mean to tell me that we have been summoned to investigate a broken chessboard?" Poirot, without lowering his newspaper, merely raised an eloquent eyebrow. "Ah, mon ami," he murmured, "you lack the patience of the chess player." Hastings frowned. "Well, I dare say I am no great strategist, but still, it seems a bit much to call in one of the world's greatest detectives for a board game mishap." Poirot finally lowered the paper, his sharp, green-flecked eyes fixing Hastings with an amused glint. "A chessboard is never just a chessboard, mon ami, and I do not believe Sir Reginald Willoughby collapsed of natural causes." Hastings straightened. "You think he was murdered?" Poirot tilted his head slightly, considering. "I think," he said quietly, "that the method was elegant, the timing impeccable, and the misdirection sublime." Hastings blinked. "But Poirot, how can you possibly know that when we haven't even arrived?" Poirot smiled gently. "Because, my dear Hastings, a game of chess is one of pure strategy. And if a man dies at the precise moment a board is overturned, then we must ask ourselves, who truly made the first move? The moment they arrived at Whitehaven Manor, Poirot and Hastings were greeted by a flustered Inspector Barnes, a solid man with a thick moustache and a perpetually weary expression. "I don't see what all the fuss is about," Barnes muttered, as he led them into the house. "A heart attack, that's what it looks like. The old man was pushing 70 after all." Poirot merely smiled politely, but his eyes were already scanning the grand hallway, taking in the details. The fresh-cut flowers on the side table, the Persian rug with a slightly disturbed corner, the faint scent of cigar smoke lingering in. The air. Everything told a story, and Poirot intended to read it. They were shown into the drawing room, where the guests from the night before had reconvened, their expressions ranging from anxious to irritated. Lady Margaret Willoughby, her eyes, red-rimmed but composed, greeted them with a dignified nod. "You must be Monsieur Poirot," she said. "Sir Reginald spoke very highly of you." Poirot bowed slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. "I am most grieved, madame, for your loss," he said sincerely. "And I promise you, I shall find the truth." She swallowed hard, but said nothing. Poirot turned his gaze to the room, his eyes settling on the chessboard, now carefully reassembled on the table. He moved closer, studying it with great interest. The pieces had been placed back in their original positions, or rather as close as one could manage from memory. Poirot bent down slightly, examining the fine cracks in the wooden board, then straightened with a thoughtful look. He turned back to the assembled guests, his voice crisp, his posture impeccable. "Mesdames et messieurs," he announced, "this was no mere accident. Sir Reginald Willoughby was murdered." A collective gasp swept through the room. Hastings stiffened beside him. "But, Poirot, how can you be sure?" Poirot smiled faintly, his fingers adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. "Because, mon ami," he murmured, "this was not just any game of chess. This was a game of death." And with that, the real investigation began. Chapter 2. The gathering of suspects. The drawing room of Whitehaven Manor was steeped in a tense silence, the air thick with unsaid words. The guests who had gathered to watch the tragic chess match the night before were now assembled once more, but the mood had shifted from curiosity to unease. Hercule Poirot, standing near the partially reassembled chessboard, studied the assembled group with a gaze both sharp and unreadable. Inspector Barnes stood at his side, arms crossed, his expression exasperated but resigned. Captain Hastings, ever the loyal companion, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, turning slightly to address the room. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice precise and deliberate, "we are faced with a most curious case. Sir Reginald Willoughby, a man in seemingly good health, falls dead at the very moment a chessboard is overturned. A coincidence, you may think." His sharp gaze flickered over the guests. "I do not believe in coincidences." A murmur ran through the room, but no one dared speak. Poirot nodded slightly. "And so, we must begin at the beginning. We must consider who had reason to wish Sir Reginald harm." His words seemed to settle heavily over the guests, and one by one, their expressions shifted from shock to guarded calculation. Everyone in the room had something to hide. Poirot's eyes swept over the group, taking in every nervous tick, every glance exchanged, every detail of posture. Seated near the fireplace was Lady Margaret Willoughby, still composed, but with tension in her shoulders that had not been there the night before. Next to her sat Leonard Styles, the Oxford mathematician, his fingers tapping against his knee, his expression one of detached curiosity. Across from them, perched stiffly in an armchair, was Edgar Norton, the financier. His face was carefully neutral, but there was something calculating in the way he studied Poirot, as if he were measuring him up like a business rival. Further back, near the windows, two younger figures stood apart from the rest. Vivian Harcourt, Sir Reginald's secretary, a woman of striking intelligence, her sharp features betraying little emotion. Henry Willoughby, Sir Reginald's nephew, whose well-tailored suit and casual stance suggested a man accustomed to privilege, and perhaps to avoiding consequences. And finally, in the farthest corner, almost blending into the background, was Dr. Bernard Atkinson, the family's longtime physician, his face troubled. His hands clasped tightly together, a closed circle of people, each of them with some connection to the deceased, each with a reason to be here on the night of the murder. Poirot surveyed them all, then turned to Lady Margaret. "Madame," he said gently, "before we proceed further, would you be so kind as to tell us about your husband's recent health?" Lady Margaret's fingers tightened slightly on her handkerchief, but her voice remained even. "My husband was in excellent health, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "His heart was strong. He had no history of illness." Poirot nodded slightly, as if he had already expected this response. "No signs of distress before last night?" he pressed. "No complaints, no weakness?" Lady Margaret hesitated, just a fraction of a second. "No," she said firmly, "nothing at all." A small twinkle flickered in Poirot's eyes. "Then I must ask, madame," he said smoothly, "why did your husband seem so disturbed when he saw the chessboard fall?" The question hung in the air like an unsolved equation. Lady Margaret's lips parted slightly, her composure faltering for the first time. I don't know," she admitted. "I didn't notice." Poirot smiled faintly, turning to the rest of the room. "And what about you, mes amis? Did anyone else observe Sir Reginald's reaction?" There was a hesitation. Then Leonard Styles, the mathematician, cleared his throat. He looked shocked, Styles admitted, as though he had seen something he did not expect. Poirot tilted his head slightly. Something or someone? Before anyone could answer, a sharp voice cut through the room. "Oh, for heaven's sake," snapped Edgar Norton, the financier. "This is absurd. The man was elderly. Perhaps the shock of the chessboard falling simply startled him." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And yet, Monsieur Norton, you did not seem particularly startled yourself." Norton's jaw tightened. "I don't make a habit of jumping at shadows." Poirot nodded as though filing away the remark for later. He turned next to Henry Willoughby, the nephew, who had been studying his nails with the air of a man who would rather be anywhere else. "Tell me, Monsieur Willoughby," Poirot said, "what was your uncle's relationship with you?" Henry looked up, blinking as though the question had taken him off guard. "My uncle?" he repeated. "We got along well enough." Poirot's smile did not waver. "And by well enough, you mean—" a flicker of annoyance passed over Henry's face. "I mean, he was a stubborn old relic," he muttered, "always telling me how to live my life. But he meant well." Poirot watched him carefully. And yet, he had not yet named. "You as his heir, had he?" The room stilled. Henry's eyes flashed. "That's none of your business." Poirot gave a small shrug, as if the answer had already been given. Just as Poirot was about to speak again, Vivian Harcourt, the sharp-eyed secretary, stepped forward. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. Poirot turned. To her with polite interest, Vivian's hands were clasped tightly together, but her voice was steady. "I went to clean up the chessboard after the incident," she said. "And I noticed one piece was missing." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Which piece, mademoiselle?" Vivian hesitated, then said, "The Black King." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Poirot exhaled softly, almost as if he had been expecting this revelation. He turned back to the assembled guests, his voice calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this is no longer simply a question of cause of death. It is a question of symbolism." His eyes flickered with certainty. The missing king, the moment of death, the reaction of the victim. It is all part of a carefully orchestrated move. Hastings frowned. You mean, like a strategy? Poirot smiled faintly. Exactly, mon ami. This was not just a crime. This was a game. He turned back to the guests, his voice dropping slightly. And whoever orchestrated this little tableau is still among us. A heavy silence fell over the room. Poirot smoothed his lapels, his mind already at work. The game had begun. And he intended to win. Chapter 3. The First Interviews. The air inside Whitehaven Manor remained thick with tension. Long after Poirot's pronouncement. A crime disguised as a game, a missing chess piece, a man dead at the moment of its disappearance. The elements of the mystery were beginning to align, but the final picture remained hidden. Hercule Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, surveying the room with a calculating gaze. The assembled suspects shifted uneasily, aware that their actions, their words, and even the tiniest betrayals of body language were now under his careful scrutiny. I must ask that none of you leave Whitehaven Manor until the investigation is complete, Poirot announced. For now, I will begin with a few simple interviews. He gestured toward a corner of the room, where a small writing desk sat near the window, the morning light filtering in through heavy curtains. Poirot took a seat, adjusting the perfectly symmetrical crease in his trousers, then looked up. Let us start with the one who knew Sir Reginald's habits best. His eyes settled on Vivian Harcourt, the secretary. She inclined her head, her expression calm, unreadable, and took a seat across from him. Poirot studied her for a moment. There was a precision in her manner, a deliberate neatness that rivaled his own. Her blouse was immaculate, her posture unflinching, her hands folded in her lap. Mademoiselle Harcourt, he said at last, how long have you been in Sir Reginald's employ? 6 years, she answered. And in those 6 years you knew his habits well, oui? Vivian nodded. Sir Reginald was a man of strict routine. He rose at precisely 7 o'clock each morning, had his tea in the conservatory, read the Times, and dictated correspondence before lunch. Every evening, he indulged in a game of chess, sometimes alone, sometimes with a guest. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Then let me ask you this. Did Sir Reginald have any enemies? Vivian hesitated, but only for a fraction of a second. None that I am aware of. Come now, mademoiselle, Poirot pressed gently. A man such as Sir Reginald, a diplomat, a man of influence, surely he had his share of those who wished him ill. She pursed her lips. If he did, he never spoke of them. Poirot nodded slowly. Very well. Tell me then, what was his relationship with Edgar Norton? Vivian's eyes flickered. They had known each other for many years, business acquaintances, more than friends, and yet they were playing chess together the night he died? Yes, she confirmed. Sir Reginald had invited Mr. Norton as part of his contest of minds. Poirot tapped a finger lightly against the desk. Did Sir Reginald seem anxious in the days leading up to the party? This time Vivian hesitated a fraction longer. I wouldn't say anxious, she said carefully, but he was preoccupied. Preoccupied with what? She pressed her lips together. He never said. Poirot watched her in silence, his green-flecked eyes probing. She was telling the truth, or rather a version of the truth. Finally he nodded. Merci, Mademoiselle Harcourt. That will be all for now. Vivian rose gracefully and left the desk, her heels clicking softly against the polished wood. Poirot turned to Inspector Barnes, who had been listening in stony silence. She is holding something back, Barnes muttered. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, mon cher Barnes, but of course it is always so. The question is, why? Next to take the seat was Leonard Stiles, the mathematician. He was a thin man with sharp features, his hair slightly disheveled, as though he had been caught in a problem of numbers from which he had yet to emerge. "Mr. Styles," Poirot greeted. "It was you who played against Mr. Norton last night, was it not?" Styles nodded. "Yes, we had agreed upon a single game. Whoever won would challenge Sir Reginald." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And who won?" Styles hesitated, glancing toward the chessboard as though replaying the game in his mind. "Norton did," he admitted. "Though I don't believe it was entirely fair." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "You suspect he cheated?" Styles's mouth twisted into something between a frown and a smirk. "No, nothing quite so crude. But Norton has a habit of pressuring his opponents into mistakes." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "A psychological strategy?" "Exactly," Styles said. "He talks, asks odd questions, makes little remarks about the game. He doesn't just play with the pieces, he plays with your mind." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And how did Sir Reginald respond to such tactics?" Styles exhaled. "Sir Reginald never lost a game, ever. If Norton thought he could shake him, he was mistaken." Poirot steepled his fingers. "And yet, monsieur, Sir Reginald did not live to finish the game." Styles swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Slightly, no," he admitted quietly. "He didn't. Last came Edgar Norton, the financier." He took the seat with a quiet confidence, adjusting the cufflinks on his crisp suit before meeting Poirot's gaze. "Let's not waste time, shall we?" Norton said smoothly. "You think I had something to do with Sir Reginald's death, don't?" "You?" Poirot smiled politely. "I think only that you were the last person to play against him. Surely that makes you an important witness." Norton chuckled dryly. "I imagine you'd like me to tell you that Sir Reginald and I had a heated rivalry, that we argued over some past business deal, and that I threatened him before the game began." Poirot's expression remained neutral. "And did you?" "No," Norton said flatly. "We played, as we always did, with strategic minds and sharp tongues. He was alive when I made my last move, and dead by the time the board was overturned. If you want a murderer, look elsewhere." Poirot's smile did not waver. "Tell me, Monsieur Norton," he said, "do you recall what move you made before Sir Reginald collapsed?" Norton paused, his fingers tightening slightly. "Yes," he admitted after a moment. "I moved my queen." Poirot nodded slowly. "And which piece did Sir Reginald prepare to move?" Norton's face darkened slightly. "The Black King." Silence filled the room. Poirot's voice was barely above a whisper. "The piece that is now missing." Norton's expression remained impassive. But Poirot saw it, the tiny flicker of something buried deep beneath his carefully composed features, something that looked very much like fear. Poirot sat back, his fingers tapping lightly, against the arm of his chair. "The game is not over yet, monsieur," he murmured, and in his mind, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Chapter 4, The First False Lead. The interviews had done little to clarify who had killed Sir Reginald Willoughby, but to Hercule Poirot they had revealed something far more valuable, what his suspects wished to hide. The missing Black King, the subtle evasions, the careful half-truths, each detail was a thread in the intricate tapestry of motive, deception, and opportunity. Now, as Poirot sat in the drawing room, fingers lightly pressed together in contemplation, Inspector Barnes paced impatiently, his boots thudding against the floor. "Well?" Barnes grumbled. "What do you make of them?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear Inspector, they are a most fascinating ensemble, are they not?" Barnes rolled his eyes. "Fascinating, perhaps. Cooperative? Hardly. They're all hiding something, that much is clear." Poirot nodded. "Mais bien sûr, but do not mistake secrets for guilt, mon cher Barnes. Every person here has something to protect, but only one among them has committed murder." Hastings, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "What about Norton?" he asked. "The way he reacted when you mentioned the Black King." He knows something. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Indeed, but what does he know? That is the question. Barnes exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. I still don't see why we don't just assume the obvious. The man was old. He had a shock. He died. Why insist it was murder? Poirot sighed. You are a man of evidence, Inspector. You desire the corporeal proof, the thing that can be touched, examined, measured. Barnes frowned. And you don't? Poirot's smile widened slightly. Oh, I, too, require evidence, mon ami. But I deal in the intangible, in that which cannot be held, but which governs all human behavior. The mind. He leaned forward slightly. And tell me this, Inspector. Why would a murderer take a single chess piece? Barnes opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no answer. Poirot sat back. There is something very deliberate in that act, he murmured. The killer did not panic. The killer did not act in haste. The killer made a move, a precise, calculated move, as if playing a game. He paused, then added, and that is what troubles me most. Before Barnes could respond, the door swung open, and a uniformed constable hurried inside, his face flushed with urgency. Sir, we've found something! Poirot and Barnes both rose at once. Where? Barnes demanded. The constable swallowed. In the study, sir. Hidden in the desk drawer. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Then let us not delay, mes amis, he murmured. They followed the constable through the dimly lit hallways until they reached Sir Reginald's study, a small but elegant room lined with bookshelves and a heavy oak desk at its center. A single gas lamp flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. Barnes stepped forward, his gaze falling on the desk, where an item had been carefully laid out for inspection. A small glass vial. Poirot's fingers twitched slightly, but he made no move to pick it up. Instead, he turned to the constable. You found it where exactly? In the locked drawer, sir. Barnes let out a low whistle. Locked, was it? And who had the key? The constable hesitated. We found that too, sir. In the possession of Mr. Styles. A sharp silence fell over the room. Poirot and Hastings exchanged a brief glance. Leonard Styles? Hastings said. The mathematician? Yes, sir. Poirot remained still for a long moment. Then he took a single step forward, bending slightly, to inspect the vial without touching it. It was small, delicate, and made of clear glass. Inside, a few drops of liquid remained, clinging to the edges. Poirot's lips pressed together. Inspector, he said softly, I believe this is your corporeal proof. Barnes frowned. Poirot, are you saying this is... Poirot straightened. It is poison, mon ami. A gasp came from the doorway. The group turned to see Vivian Harcourt standing there, her expression one of pure shock. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Ah, Mademoiselle Harcourt, he said. You seem surprised. Vivian hesitated, stepping further into the room. I never thought... Poirot studied her intently, but said nothing. Barnes, meanwhile, turned to the constable. Where is Styles now? In his room, sir. Shall I bring him? Barnes nodded. At once. A few minutes later, Leonard Styles was led into the study, looking pale and unsettled. I don't understand, he muttered as he was ushered inside. Why am I being questioned again? Barnes stepped forward. Mr. Styles, he said grimly, do you deny that you had the key to this drawer in your possession? Styles' eyes widened. What? No. I mean, yes, I had the key. But it wasn't mine. I found it. Barnes snorted. And you didn't think to turn it over to the authorities? I didn't know it was important. Poirot stepped closer, his gaze piercing. Monsieur Styles, he said, his voice soft but firm, do you recognize this vial? Styles stared at it, his breath quickening. I don't know what it is. Poirot tilted his head. Are you quite sure, monsieur? Styles swallowed hard. I swear it! His words cut off sharply as Barnes turned to the constable. Take him into custody. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Poirot remained motionless, his expression unreadable as Styles was. Seized by the arm. This is absurd, Styles shouted, his voice raw with panic. You're making a mistake. I didn't kill Sir Reginald. Hastings frowned. Poirot, surely this is... Poirot raised a hand. Calm yourself, mon ami, he said quietly. There is still much to consider. Styles was dragged toward the door. Poirot watched, his face impassive. Then, just as Styles was about to be led away, Poirot spoke once more. Tell me, Monsieur Styles, he said, if you are innocent, then perhaps you can answer me this. Styles froze, his breathing shallow. Poirot's eyes were sharp as knives. Who then took the Black King? A horrified silence filled the room. Styles said nothing. Poirot sighed softly, then turned to Hastings. This, mon ami, he murmured, is what we call a false lead. And as the door slammed shut behind Styles, Poirot knew the real game was only just beginning. Chapter 5. The Psychological Game begins. The echoes of Leonard Styles's protests had barely faded from the halls of Whitehaven Manor when Hercule Poirot settled back into his chair, his hands neatly folded over his chest, his expression calm yet unreadable. Inspector Barnes, still standing by the oak desk in the study, let out a long, frustrated sigh. Well, Poirot, he muttered, you got what you wanted, didn't you? A suspect in custody. Poirot lifted an elegant eyebrow. Ah, non, mon cher Barnes, he corrected smoothly. What I have is a distraction. Barnes frowned. What are you talking about? You were the one who pointed out the poison. Indeed, Poirot nodded. And yet, tell me, Inspector, have you not wondered, why poison? Barnes opened his mouth, then closed it. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into that familiar murmur of deduction. You see, mes amis, poison is a very intimate method of murder. It requires patience, forethought, an understanding of one's victim. It is the weapon of someone who does not wish to be seen. He tapped his temple. But our killer? Our killer did not merely want Sir Reginald dead. They wanted to make a statement. Hastings frowned. A statement? What do you mean? Poirot sighed. The poison was the method, but the broken chessboard, the missing Black King. His voice lowered slightly. That was the message. Barnes shifted uneasily. So you think the chessboard means something? Poirot gave him a knowing smile. My dear Inspector, I do not think. I know. Poirot rose from his chair and began to pace slowly, his polished shoes making soft, deliberate sounds against the floor. Consider, mes amis, the actions of our murderer, he said. They did not kill Sir Reginald in the dead of night. They did not strike him in a moment of passion. He turned back toward them, his eyes gleaming with calculation. No. Instead, they chose to wait until the moment of a chess match, until Sir Reginald was about to make his next move. Hastings blinked. You mean, his move was important? Tres. Important, Poirot nodded. Because the killer did not just want to remove Sir Reginald. No, they wanted to stop him. Hastings frowned. Stop him from what? Poirot turned back toward the chessboard. That, my dear Hastings, is the mystery. Inspector Barnes ran a frustrated hand through his graying hair. All right, Poirot. Let's say you're right. Let's say the killer had some grand symbolic reason for doing this. What now? Styles had the key, and we found the poison in Reginald's desk. Poirot gave a knowing smile. Ah, but let us examine this closely, mon ami. Styles had the key, yes. But where was the key found? Barnes frowned. In his room. And the poison? In the locked drawer. Poirot nodded slowly. Tell me, Inspector, if you had poisoned a man, would you keep the vial in your own desk? Would you then leave the key with someone else, ensuring that they are blamed? A brief silence followed. Hastings blinked. You mean someone planted the evidence? Poirot spread his hands. Mais oui, consider. Styles is a mathematician, a man who prides himself on logic. Would such a man, so intelligent, make a mistake so convenient? Barnes exhaled sharply. So you think the real killer set him up? Poirot's voice dropped slightly. I think, mon cher Barnes, that the killer is playing a most dangerous game, one of deception, misdirection, and power. His gaze flickered toward the chessboard again. But as with all games, there is one thing they cannot control. Hastings leaned forward slightly. And what's that? Poirot's lips curved into a slight smile. The mind of Hercule Poirot. Before anyone could respond, a soft knock came at the door. The butler, an aging man with a precise, careful demeanor, stepped forward, clearing his throat. Begging your pardon, sir, he said, but I found this among Sir Reginald's personal papers. Poirot extended a graceful hand, accepting the item, a small folded piece of parchment, aged but undisturbed. Slowly, Poirot unfolded it. His eyes scanned the words. Then he stilled completely. Hastings frowned. Poirot? Poirot did not look up. His fingers tightened slightly on the paper, his gaze flickering over the words again and again. Finally, he murmured, It is a name. Barnes stepped forward. A name? Poirot nodded, then held the letter just out. A view, mes amis, he said softly. I do believe we have just found our motive. Hastings's breath caught. What does it say? Poirot looked up at them at last. It is a warning, he murmured. Then, his voice quiet, ominous, he read aloud. The king must not fall. A chill settled over the room. Barnes shook his head. What the devil does that mean? Poirot folded the letter carefully, slipping it into the pocket of his neatly pressed jacket. It means, my dear Inspector, he said, that we must find the missing Black King, and we must find it before our murderer strikes again. Hastings inhaled sharply. You think they'll kill again? Poirot smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. I think, mon ami, that they already intend to. The study fell into silence, and for the first time since arriving at Whitehaven Manor, Hercule Poirot felt the weight of the game pressing down upon him. It was no longer just a matter of solving a puzzle. It was a matter of who would make the next move, and whether, when that move came, Poirot would be ready. Chapter 6. The Second Crime. A sharp wind rattled the windows of Whitehaven Manor, a chilling reminder that the storm raging inside the estate was no less fierce than the one outside. Poirot, seated comfortably in the study, allowed the weight of the newly discovered letter to settle upon the room. The king must not fall. It was a message, certainly. A warning, perhaps. But more than that, it was a challenge. And Poirot had no doubt that the game was far from over. Inspector Barnes was pacing again, his boots thudding against the carpet as he muttered under his breath. Damn cryptic messages, he grumbled. Who writes something like that and just leaves it behind? Poirot smiled faintly, folding his hands over his chest. Ah, mon cher Barnes, but do you not see? This is a game of strategy, and in a game such as this, one does not leave behind a message by accident. Hastings leaned forward. Then you think Sir Reginald knew something? Not only knew, Poirot murmured, but feared. A tense silence followed. Then, before Poirot could say another word, a scream tore through the air. Poirot bolted upright, his sharp eyes flickering toward the door. A moment later, the study doors burst open, and a housemaid stumbled inside, her face pale as death. "Sir," she gasped, It's Mr. Norton! Poirot's stomach tightened. Hastings shot to his feet. What about him? The maid clutched the door frame, her voice trembling. He's dead! They found Edgar. Norton in the guest bedroom, his body slumped over the side of a chaise lounge, his lifeless eyes staring toward the darkened fireplace. A book lay at his feet, the pages slightly crumpled as if he had dropped it mid-turn. Poirot approached slowly, his keen gaze sweeping the scene before him. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle. But something about the stillness of the room unsettled him. Inspector Barnes let out a low curse. Well, that's it then, he muttered. This proves it wasn't just an accident with Sir Reginald. Poirot barely heard him. He was already moving, his fingers adjusting the cuffs of his jacket as he surveyed Norton's body with precise calculation. It was Hastings who spoke next. No sign of a wound, he said, voice edged with disbelief. Could it be poison? Again? Poirot reached out and gently pressed his fingers to Norton's wrist. The skin was still warm. Poirot's eyes flickered toward the bedside table. A glass of brandy sat there, untouched, and then he saw it. A chess piece, placed carefully on the floor beside the corpse. A black knight. Poirot's breath caught. The black king was still missing. But now another piece had entered the game. Barnes crouched down beside the body, his fingers brushing against the knight piece. What the devil? Is this? He muttered. What kind of murderer leaves behind a different chess piece each time? Poirot sighed softly, his mind racing. A murderer with a pattern, mon ami. And a very deliberate one at that. Hastings frowned. But what does the knight mean? Poirot didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze flicked back toward Norton's still form, his sharp mind reconstructing the moment of death. He was reading, Poirot murmured. Something startled him. He dropped the book. He bent down, picking up the novel that had slipped from Norton's grasp. The title read, The Art of Strategy. Poirot exhaled softly. Strategy, he murmured. And the knight, a piece known for its deceptive movement, a piece that jumps. Hastings frowned. But what does that mean? Poirot straightened, his expression unreadable. It means, he said quietly, that our killer is moving the pieces not randomly, but with purpose. Inspector Barnes rubbed his temples. So let's take stock of what we know. Reginald Willoughby was poisoned, but we don't know how the poison was administered. Norton, on the other hand, just dropped dead. No sign of poison, no wounds, nothing. And both of them were left with chess pieces. Poirot nodded. A game of death, Inspector. And now it has escalated. Barnes let out a heavy sigh. And what about Styles? He's still locked up, isn't he? Poirot smiled faintly. Indeed, he murmured. Which means, mon ami, that the real killer is still among us. Barnes stiffened. So Styles was innocent? Poirot inclined his head. Ah, but did I ever say he was guilty? Barnes groaned. Poirot, I swear to God. Hastings, ignoring their exchange, was staring at Norton's body, his brows furrowed in thought. There's something else that doesn't add up, he murmured. Poirot turned to him. Go on. Mon ami. Hastings hesitated, then gestured toward Norton's book. If the killer wanted to get rid of Norton, why now? Why not wait? Poirot's eyes gleamed with approval. An excellent question, Hastings. And the answer? Hastings frowned. The killer wasn't just trying to eliminate Norton. They were making sure he couldn't talk. Poirot smiled. Fully now, a rare flicker of pride in his expression. Exactement. Barnes straightened, his face dark with realization. You're saying Norton knew something? Poirot nodded. I suspect he did not even realize it. But yes, I believe Mr. Norton may have been in possession of knowledge that made him dangerous. He turned back toward the body. The question is, what did he know? Barnes let out a sharp breath. Well, we'd better start looking through his things then. Poirot held up a hand. No, no, mon cher Barnes. This is not merely about documents or letters. His gaze swept the room once more. It is about human nature. He gestured toward the Black Knight on the floor. The killer is playing a game, which means, if we follow their moves carefully, his voice dropped, we will see their next move before they do. A heavy silence fell over the room. Hastings exhaled slowly. So what's the next move? Poirot turned, his eyes gleaming with certainty. The killer is growing desperate. They have taken a second life to protect their secret. But a game like this, his voice softened, his fingers lightly adjusting his cuffs, can only end in checkmate. Barnes stared at him. Poirot smiled. And I, Inspector, do not intend to lose. Chapter 7. Poirot's next move. The silence in Whitehaven Manor had taken on a different quality. It was no longer the tense quiet of suspicion. It was the heavy, expectant hush of those who knew that something terrible had already happened, and something worse might be just around the corner. The death of Edgar Norton had shattered any lingering illusions that Sir Reginald Willoughby's death had been an accident. Poirot's theory had been proven correct. The first death was not simply about eliminating a man. It was about sending a message. Now the game had escalated, and if Poirot was right, the killer's next move would be soon. Inspector Barnes rubbed his temples, his frustration evident as he leaned over the study desk, where the vial of poison, the missing Black King, and now the Black Knight chess piece had all been placed side by side. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. Why? Poison one victim and leave no clear cause of death for the other? The methods don't match. Poirot, seated in an armchair by the fireplace, steepled his fingers thoughtfully. Ah, but you are thinking only of the method, mon cher Barnes. You must consider instead the message. Hastings, seated beside him, frowned deeply. The message? Poirot nodded. Consider the sequence, Hastings. A Black King is taken, but not found. Now a knight has been left beside a second victim. Hastings blinked. So, the killer is following a pattern? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Just so. Barnes exhaled sharply. But why these specific pieces? Poirot rose, moving to the chessboard that had been reassembled on a side table, though the Black King was still missing. Because, he murmured, brushing a hand over the board's smooth surface. This is not a game of mere elimination. This is a game of strategy. He turned back to them. And that means that our killer, whoever they are, is not simply choosing victims at random. They are mirroring a sequence of moves. Hastings stiffened. Then you think there will be another? Poirot sighed. The game is unfinished, mon ami. And until it reaches its final play, the killer will not stop. A chill settled over the room. Poirot turned suddenly, his sharp gaze locking onto Barnes. We must return to the beginning, he announced. To Sir Reginald's study. Barnes, looking perplexed, nonetheless followed Poirot and Hastings through the dimly lit hallways, back to the study where Sir Reginald had last lived. The room remained undisturbed, save for the fresh coating of dust beginning to settle over the desk. Poirot moved with precision, his eyes scanning the shelves, the fireplace, the windows, every surface, every potential hiding place. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, he moved toward Sir Reginald's desk. Carefully, he ran his fingers along the edge of a drawer, then paused. There, he murmured. A scratch, faint, but deliberate. Hastings stepped forward. What do you mean? Poirot tapped the surface lightly. This drawer has been forced open recently. Barnes frowned. But we already found the poison in the other drawer. Ah. But mon ami, Poirot murmured, his fingers working deftly to ease open the drawer. This is not about the poison. With a final click, the drawer gave way. Inside, Nestled between stacks of neatly folded correspondence lay a second letter. Poirot carefully lifted it, unfolding the delicate paper with meticulous precision. His eyes narrowed as he read, and then, without looking up, he murmured, "This is what got Sir Reginald killed." Barnes stepped forward quickly. "What does it say?" Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "It is a letter, mes amis, addressed not to Sir Reginald, but to someone else." Hastings leaned in. "Who?" Poirot lifted his gaze slowly. "To Leonard Styles." Barnes froze. "Styles?" Poirot nodded. "And it is not merely a letter, it is a warning." He read aloud, "Leonard, I have been looking into the matter you mentioned. I fear you are correct. If I do not act soon, the consequences will be grave. I will speak with Norton tomorrow. If anything should happen to me, remember, the king must not fall." A heavy silence followed. Hastings let out a slow breath. "This means Styles knew something." Poirot nodded. "Indeed. And now we must ask ourselves, why did Sir Reginald try to warn him?" Before anyone could react, a loud, frantic knock came at the study door. A footman burst inside, his face pale with fear. "Sir, it's Mr. Styles. He's trying to escape." Poirot spun on his heel. "Where?" "The front drive, sir. He's taken one of the carriages." Poirot did not wait. With Hastings and Barnes at his heels, he rushed through the halls of Whitehaven Manor, emerging into the cold night air just in time to see a black carriage speeding toward the gates. Barnes cursed. "He's running!" Poirot's voice was sharp. "No, he is being hunted." And just as he spoke, a gunshot split the night. The carriage lurched violently, veering off the road, and with a horrific crash, it toppled onto its side in the ditch. Poirot's breath caught. Hastings stared in horror. Barnes drew his revolver. Poirot whispered, "The game has reached its climax." The killer was making their final move, and if Poirot was correct, only one more piece remained on the board. Chapter 8. The Truth Behind the King's Fall. The aftermath of the carriage crash unfolded with a terrible urgency. The wind howled. Through the darkened estate grounds, the twisted wreck of the carriage tilted into the ditch, one wheel still spinning in the air. Inspector Barnes and a handful of constables rushed forward, their lanterns casting jagged beams of light across the scene. Poirot and Hastings followed closely, their footsteps crunching against the frozen grass as they reached the wreckage. Inside the upturned carriage, Leonard Styles lay motionless. His head rested awkwardly against the shattered window frame, his breathing shallow. A thin trickle of blood ran from a gash along his temple. Poirot knelt beside him, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. Hastings swallowed. "Is he?" Poirot pressed 2 fingers against Styles's neck, waiting. Then with a slight nod he murmured, "He lives, mon ami." But barely. Barnes muttered a curse under his breath. Somebody wanted him dead. Poirot exhaled softly. Indeed. He turned toward the carriage. And yet, this was no accident. This was a shot fired from the shadows. Barnes scowled. "Meaning what?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Meaning our killer knew that Styles held the truth, and that they had only moments left before that truth would be revealed." Barnes snapped, toward one of his constables. "Get the doctor, now!" The constable nodded briskly and ran toward the manor. Poirot remained still for a moment, his mind turning rapidly. Then softly, he whispered, "The killer is growing desperate, and when desperation sets in, mon ami, one always makes a mistake." Within moments, the estate grounds were alive with movement. Barnes had ordered a search of the surrounding areas, but the shooter had vanished into the night like a phantom. Back inside Whitehaven Manor, the atmosphere was suffocating with suspicion. The remaining guests, Lady Margaret Willoughby, Henry Willoughby, Vivian Harcourt, and Dr. Bernard Atkinson, had been gathered in the drawing room, their expressions varying from shock to barely concealed fear. Poirot stood at the center of the room, surveying each face carefully. His gaze settled on Henry Willoughby, Sir Reginald's nephew, who had positioned himself near the drinks cabinet, his fingers drumming absently against the mahogany. "You seem ill at ease, monsieur," Poirot remarked. Henry's eyes flicked toward him. "Who wouldn't be?" he retorted. "There's a murderer among us. That's rather unsettling, wouldn't you say?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Unsettling, perhaps, but I sense in you not just fear, but something else. Perhaps anticipation?" Henry stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "Then tell me, monsieur, where were you when the gunshot was fired?" Henry's jaw clenched. "I was here with the others," he replied smoothly. "Lady Margaret, Dr. Atkinson, and Miss Harcourt can all vouch for that." Poirot turned to the rest of the group. "Is this true?" Lady Margaret, her face pale but composed, nodded. "Yes, we were all together in the parlor." Poirot narrowed his eyes slightly. "And yet there is something peculiar, no?" Henry folded his arms. "And what's that?" Poirot paused for effect, then murmured, "The killer does not need to be the one to pull the trigger." A stifling silence followed. Poirot straightened. "Tell me, monsieur," he continued smoothly, "what were your dealings with Edgar Norton?" Henry flinched, ever so slightly. "I hardly knew the man," he muttered. "Ah, but that is not true, is it?" Poirot's voice was gentle yet unyielding. "For I have learned something most curious." His eyes flickered toward Vivian Harcourt, who had remained silent throughout the interrogation. "Miss Harcourt," Poirot said softly, "perhaps you can tell us. What business did Sir Reginald and Mr. Norton have before his death?" Vivian's fingers tightened in her lap. She hesitated. Then, softly, she whispered, "They were planning to change the will." Barnes stiffened. "Change the will?" Vivian nodded, her face drawn with hesitation. Sir Reginald had been considering a new heir. Norton had been advising him, helping draft a revised document. He was planning to remove Henry. All eyes turned to Henry Willoughby. Henry's face darkened. "That's ridiculous." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "Ah, but is it?" His voice was soft, but every word struck like a precisely placed blade. "The game of chess, such an interesting metaphor, no? And what is the Black King, if not the most important piece?" Poirot's fingers brushed against the missing space on the chessboard, where the Black King should have been. Then, he looked back at Henry. "You were about to lose everything, monsieur," Poirot murmured. "Your title, your inheritance, your fortune." Henry's face was unreadable. Poirot continued. "Sir Reginald was the king in this game, and someone wanted him removed." Henry took a slow step forward. "That doesn't mean I—" Poirot held up a hand. "Ah, but let us consider then the next piece taken." He turned toward Dr. Bernard Atkinson, the quiet, observant physician standing near the fireplace. "Doctor," Poirot murmured, "how long had Edgar Norton been in poor health?" Dr. Atkinson blinked. What?" "Norton," Poirot repeated. "Was he suffering from any ailments?" Dr. Atkinson hesitated. "No, not that I know of. He was in good health." Poirot nodded. "Then how is it, doctor, that a man with no history of illness suddenly drops dead, without a trace of poison?" Dr. Atkinson's throat bobbed. I don't know." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "I think you do, mon cher docteur." Poirot stepped back toward the chessboard. He moved his fingers over the remaining pieces. "The king," he murmured, "was the first target." He lifted an invisible piece from the board. "The knight," he continued, lifting another. "A protector of the king." He looked up sharply. Norton was not just an advisor. He was protecting Sir Reginald's interests. He knew too much. Poirot's voice was calm, almost eerily so. So, once the king fell, the knight was taken next. Hastings exhaled sharply. Good Lord. Poirot nodded. And if I am correct, mes amis. His voice dropped to a whisper. The next piece to be taken is already in danger. A terrible stillness fell over the room. Poirot straightened, adjusting his cuffs, his gaze locking onto one face in particular, a face filled with growing fear. The game is nearly over, he said softly. Then, looking toward his suspect, and you, mon ami, are next. Chapter 9. The trap is set. A charged silence followed Poirot's pronouncement. The gathered suspects sat motionless in Whitehaven Manor's dimly lit drawing room, the fire casting flickering shadows along the walls. Each person's expression, whether carefully controlled or betraying hidden fear, confirmed what Poirot already suspected. The game was nearly over. One final move remained before checkmate. Inspector Barnes shifted uncomfortably, his fingers curling into his coat pocket as he cast a wary glance at Dr. Bernard Atkinson, who had grown noticeably pale. Poirot, standing beside the chessboard, studied him carefully. "Doctor," he said softly, "do you feel it?" Atkinson's throat bobbed. "Feel what?" "The tightening of the noose," Poirot murmured. "The realization that the pieces have been moving toward this moment since the very beginning." Atkinson's hands twitched slightly. I don't know what you mean." Poirot sighed, his gaze unwavering. "But you do, mon cher docteur." And then, in a voice calm as a final chess move, Poirot stated, "Because you are next." A stirring of unease rippled through the room. Hastings, ever Poirot's steadfast companion, exhaled sharply. "Poirot, you mean to say that the killer is now targeting Dr. Atkinson?" Poirot turned away from the chessboard, his keen eyes fixed on Atkinson, who had begun breathing more rapidly, a telltale sign of a man under extreme pressure. "Oui, Hastings," Poirot said evenly. "And do you not find it curious?" Barnes frowned. "Curious." Poirot turned toward the assembled guests, his voice silken yet firm. "Our killer has taken 2 lives already. One to silence a man who was about to make a move against them. The second to eliminate a protector, Mr. Norton, the knight in this deadly game." His voice dropped to a whisper. "But now, mes amis, the pattern has shifted. The next target is not a threat, it is a warning." Hastings stiffened. "A warning? To who?" Poirot smiled coldly. "To me, mon ami," Barnes grumbled under his breath, rubbing his temples. "All right, Poirot. Suppose you're right. Suppose someone is targeting the doctor. Why?" Poirot turned sharply, his coat flaring slightly as he moved. "Because, Inspector, the letter from Sir Reginald was not only meant for Styles." His gaze settled on Dr. Atkinson. "It was meant for you as well." Atkinson's lips parted slightly, his fingers curling over the edge of the chair. I don't know what you're talking about." Poirot clicked his tongue softly, shaking his head. "Doctor, I admire a man of science, truly I do. But you are not a good liar." He moved toward the fireplace, where the embers had burned low, and held up the letter once more. "In this letter, Sir Reginald makes one thing clear. He feared for his life. He knew something dangerous. And most of all, he knew the killer's greatest secret." Poirot's voice was barely above a whisper now. "That they were playing a game." Atkinson swallowed visibly. Poirot lifted a hand. "You were his personal physician," he continued. "You would have had access to his medical records. You would have known if he had any unusual symptoms, any reason to believe that his life was in danger." Atkinson's hands tightened into fists. "But there is more," Poirot murmured. "You did not just know Sir Reginald's secrets. You knew who else was involved." A hush fell over the room, and then Poirot said, "The king was never meant to fall, was he, Doctor?" Atkinson's face drained of color. Barnes straightened sharply. Poirot. Poirot held up a single finger. A moment, if you please, Inspector. Then he turned back toward Atkinson, watching him with an eerie stillness. The killer's pattern was clear. The game follows a strategy. But I ask myself, why would they choose you next? Why target you, instead of simply disappearing now that they have won? Atkinson opened his mouth, but Poirot cut him off. Because, mon cher docteur, you have not yet made your move. The Ikel. Doctor's fingers trembled. Poirot stepped closer, lowering his voice. You know who the killer is, don't you? A sharp gasp from Lady Margaret. Hastings's eyes widened. Dr. Atkinson did not answer. Poirot continued, each word carefully enunciated, each syllable carrying the weight of certainty. You have known since the night of Sir Reginald's death. Terrible silence. Then a shuddering exhale from Atkinson. I can't, he whispered. I can't say it. Poirot stepped back slightly, nodding to himself. Then very softly he said, Then we must force the killer's hand. Inspector Barnes frowned. What do you mean, force their hand? Poirot turned away, walking slowly back toward the chessboard. His fingers brushed lightly over the pieces. Then, after a moment of thought, he picked up the white queen and placed it precisely in the center of the board. Barnes blinked. What are you doing? Poirot smiled slightly. In chess, Inspector, one does not always win by brute force. He adjusted his cuffs neatly. Sometimes one must play the game as the opponent does. Hastings frowned. And what does that mean? Poirot turned toward the group once more. It means, mon ami, that we will host one last gathering. He glanced toward Barnes. Send word throughout the house, he instructed. I want every person to be present in the main hall. Barnes hesitated. For what? Poirot smiled. For the final move, Inspector. The one that will force the killer to reveal themselves? Barnes muttered. And if they don't? Poirot's eyes shone with certainty. Oh, they will. His gaze flickered toward Dr. Atkinson, who still sat frozen, his breathing shallow. Because, if they do not, Poirot said softly, adjusting his tie, then they have already lost. Chapter 10. Checkmate. The grand hall of Whitehaven Manor was bathed in the dim glow of the chandeliers. Shadows stretched long across the walls, creating the illusion that unseen figures lurked in the corners. The assembled guests, Lady Margaret, Willoughby, Henry Willoughby, Dr. Bernard Atkinson, and Vivian Harcourt, stood in tense silence, their expressions a mix of suspicion and unease. At the center of the room, Hercule Poirot stood beside the ornate chessboard, his hands folded neatly. Before him, Inspector Barnes flanked him, his revolver holstered at his side, while Hastings watched with barely concealed tension. Poirot's gaze swept across the room. He spoke calmly, yet firmly. Mes amis, we have played a game, a most deadly game of strategy and deception. But now, the game is at its end. He picked up the white queen from the chessboard and rolled it lightly between his fingers. The king has fallen. The knight has been taken. And now, only one move remains. The guests shifted uncomfortably. The tension thickened. Poirot smiled. Faintly. You see, mes amis, the killer has been most careful, most clever, but there is one thing they did not account for. He paused for effect, then placed the queen firmly onto the board. That I, Hercule Poirot, would be watching their every move. Lady Margaret spoke first, her voice tremulous. Poirot, you keep saying there was a pattern. What pattern? Poirot turned to her smoothly. A pattern, my dear lady, that was evident from the beginning. Consider the method of the crimes. He gestured toward the chessboard. The first victim, Sir Reginald Willoughby, was the king, the most important piece. His death was not just about removing him, it was about seizing control. Poirot then picked up the Black Knight, the very piece left beside Edgar Norton's body. The second victim, Edgar Norton, was the knight, the one who stood guard, advising Sir Reginald. And what does one do with a knight in chess? One eliminates it to weaken the defense. He placed the piece down gently. And the third move? Poirot's gaze flickered to Dr. Bernard Atkinson. The next target would have been you, mon cher docteur. Atkinson paled visibly. Me? Poirot nodded. The pattern dictates it. With the king and knight gone, what is the next logical move? To remove the bishop, the one who knows too. Much, Atkinson swallowed hard. Hastings murmured. Good Lord. So the killer was following a precise order. Poirot turned, his eyes gleaming. Mais oui. And that is why, mes amis, I knew we had only one chance left to stop them. He took a step forward, his presence commanding the room. And now, I shall tell you who our killer is. A thick silence fell. Poirot's voice softened, but each word carried the weight of certainty. The killer is someone who understood the game, who knew exactly how to manipulate the moves in their favor. Someone who had motive, intelligence, and most importantly, something to lose. His gaze settled on one person. The murderer is you, Henry Willoughby. A stunned silence filled the room. Henry stared at Poirot, his face unreadable. Then, very slowly, he let out a short laugh. You're mad, he said. Why on earth would I kill my own uncle? Poirot smiled slightly. Ah, but that is where you miscalculate, monsieur. You see, it was not just about your uncle. Lifted a hand, gesturing toward Dr. Atkinson. It was about the will. Sir Reginald was planning to change it, removing you as his heir. Henry's jaw tightened. You knew, Poirot continued, his voice unshakable, that if Sir Reginald followed through with his decision, you would be left with nothing. He stepped forward, his voice cool and sharp as a blade. So you devised a plan, one that was as precise and strategic as a chess match. Poirot lifted the missing Black King from his pocket, the chess piece that had been taken from the board on the night of Sir Reginald's murder. This was your first move, he said. Sir Reginald's death, his removal from the game. Henry remained still. Poirot then lifted the Black Knight. Edgar Norton was your next target, not just because he was an advisor, but because he was the one drafting the new will. He had to die before he could finalize it. Henry's fingers twitched at his sides. Poirot's eyes narrowed. But when Norton was killed, you made a mistake. You forgot one thing. Henry's lips parted slightly. And what was that? Poirot smiled faintly. That I was watching. Poirot turned to Barnes. Inspector, you recall. The gunshot that nearly killed Leonard Stiles? Barnes nodded. Yes. We assumed the killer was trying to silence him. Poirot exhaled. Ah, but that was not their true intention. His gaze swung back to Henry Willoughby. You, monsieur, are too intelligent to act impulsively. No, you would not attempt to shoot a man unless it served a greater purpose. Poirot's voice was sharp now, piercing through the tension like a knife. The shot was not meant to kill, it was meant to distract. Henry's face darkened. Poirot smiled slightly. While we were all focused on Stiles and the carriage crash, you had just enough time to do what you truly needed, to remove the final evidence linking you to the first two murders. A tense silence. Then, Poirot turned to Barnes. Search his room, Inspector. You will find the missing poison vial, tucked away where he believed it would never be discovered. Henry's breath caught. Barnes, without hesitation, turned to his men. Search his things, now. Henry took a step back, his face twisting in anger. This is ridiculous, he snapped. You can't just... Then, a single fatal mistake. In his agitation, Henry's fingers brushed against his coat pocket. Poirot's gaze snapped downward, catching the movement. His smile sharpened. Ah, he murmured. There it is. And... Before Henry could move, Barnes lunged forward, seizing his wrist. With a swift movement, the inspector reached into Henry's coat and withdrew the missing vial. A heavy silence fell over the room. Henry's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Poirot adjusted his cuffs, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "Checkmate, monsieur." Henry let out a shaky breath, then sank into the nearest chair, defeated. Barnes snapped his fingers, and the constables moved forward, clamping a hand on Henry's shoulder. Poirot watched calmly. The game was over. Later that evening, Poirot and Hastings stood by the library window, watching as Henry Willoughby was escorted into a waiting police carriage. Hastings shook his head. "A brilliant case, Poirot." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, Hastings, in chess and in crime, the most important thing is always the same." Hastings raised a brow. "And that is?" Poirot turned away, adjusting his tie. "To see the board before, the opponent does." And with that, the great detective closed the case.